The weird thing is, I was actually planning to report Edna. Having worked in a hospital as a nurse for almost 20 years, I knew the usual ebb and flow of how things worked. With Edna, it didn't work right. There were just far too many coincidences, too many convenient confluences of circumstance for it all to be an accident, and for there not to be some kind of pattern to the whole thing. Had I not seen what I saw, then I most probably would have reported her immediately. In the end, though, I walked to the office, not with a report to file against Edna, but with my own letter of resignation. In the end, it turned out there was a pattern, just not the one I expected. Over the course of 3 months, I'd found Edna standing either as the attendant nurse or simply someone who happened to be close by when over 80 individuals had died on the wards. Whilst death is something that people in my profession unfortunately have to come to accept, and which we all have to deal with on a daily basis, the frequency with which Edna just happened to be close to people when they expired made me suspicious. I had seen a number of documentaries, read news stories, and even knew a friend who had worked with mentally ill practitioners who had deliberately ended the lives of their patients prematurely, either by giving them overdoses of medication or secretly denying them particular treatments. For me, the coincidence just seemed too striking, so I decided to watch her, to surreptitiously monitor her movements, to see who she attended to, and to keep an eye on what became of them. On one occasion, I watched her attend to an old man who was clearly in quite a lot of pain. Comforting him for a moment, she eventually came around to the end of the bed, and so I thought, placed some small object under the sheets at the end of the bed. This, of course, only made me more suspicious. Later, when Edna was well out of sight, I went to check on the spot where she had been standing and adjusting the bed. At the bottom, directly below the old man's feet, was a small porcelain jar, around 3 inches long, which at one time had been stoppered with a cork, which now lay beside the bottle in a small recess at the bottom of the frame. Instantly, I seized upon this. If this was some kind of poison or chemical left within feet of the patients, then it could theoretically have been linked in some way to the unusually high number of deaths on Edna's watch. I sniffed the jar, and finding it to have an oddly familiar scent that reminded me of churches, I decided to replace the stopper, take the stuff to be analysed, and report Edna at first opportunity. As I turned to leave, however, I found that my path was blocked. Edna was standing in the doorway. She held me gaze, looking slowly down to the object in my hand, and back up again. Then, very slowly and deliberately, she closed the door to the room, shutting us in together. I thought of screaming, or perhaps trying to force my way past her using my fists. Instead, I chose to confront her. "I know what you're doing," I announced. "No, you don't," said Edna curtly in response, walking toward me slowly. She took the tiny vessel from my hand and I offered no resistance. "This," she said, "is a modicum jar. It is believed to contain sacred myrrh given to Christ at his birth. Tradition states that if it is left at the feet of a dying man, his soul will stick to the oil like a fly to flypaper, trapped and unable to proceed to heaven or hell." Edna then took my hand, clamping me around the wrist. The moment she touched me, things changed. I saw on the bed, not just a man, but a man, covered all over with a layer of a thick black smoke. In that smoke danced tiny snapshot visions, the crimes he had committed. Whether it was the man's soul, his aura, or whatever, I don't know, but Edna saw it all the time. She saw it on scores of people and could see that these were wicked folk. She could also see when the person did not have long left. I catch them as a mercy. I keep their souls in these jars because whilst they are in there, they are at least saved the torment of hell for a while. Perhaps if they repent in time, they can change their fate. She told me she had dozens of these soul bottles on her home, hoping for the day they'd be empty and the souls forgiven. At first I believed that and thought of what she did as she described it, as a mercy. It was only 3 months and many souls later that I finally reported Edna. That was after I looked up Mordicum jars on Google and found that one individual was selling dozens of these jars. Why anyone would want to buy the souls of wicked men I did not know. What I did know was who was selling them. An empty bed in a hospital can be a good thing. Other times it can be a very bad thing indeed. When a patient you've been dealing with for a long time is fully recovered and finally discharged, then the sight of a briefly unoccupied bed, neatly folded down with the infamous hospital corners, can give a sense of satisfaction. The empty space represents a job well done. Other times, you come onto shift expecting to see a patient who seemed to be doing well, and find again that same empty bed. This time, though it means something different. You feel your heart sink, knowing that in the night the patient has taken a turn for the worse. An empty bed usually means a full coffin by the following day. In 1997, I was a trainee doctor and went overseas to do a work experience placement in a hospital in Zambia. There, I saw for the first and only time, beds being emptied on purpose. I had been working at the hospital, doing what I could in conditions and with provisions well below the expected standard for around 3 months. I had Saturdays off, but the rest of the week I worked long and often brutally intense shifts characterized by the twin frustrations of overcrowding and underfunding. One week, however, I was told not only that I was to work Saturday, but also that I was not under any circumstances to come to the hospital for the following 3 days. When I was asked why, I was told to just not come and to not ask questions, so I took the time off. It was only in the early evening of my first day off that I decided to protest, and for good reason. Heading into town, I saw one of my patients, still attached to a drip, being loaded onto a flatback truck. I was outraged. The patient was nowhere near well enough to be moved, and the hygiene in the back of the truck nowhere near suitable. I ran across the road in an attempt to stop this travesty, and saw that this was not the only patient. Scores of them were being carried out, on stretchers or still on their beds into the hot sun, and loaded into cars and trucks. I ran from patient to patient trying to tell the orderlies and porters to stop, but the movers just ignored me. Finally, I met my immediate boss at the hospital, who, to my disbelief, was angry at me for being there. Taking me aside, he tried to explain. These 3 days, there is the Serocar coming. It comes with the ill wind, and like the hyena, it can smell death, decay, and illness. In the past, it would come to villages, sniffing out the elderly and sick so it would take them. Nowadays it knows hospitals are full of the sick. If it comes to the hospital and finds these people there, it will smell their sickness. It will smell them and it will take them. We have to hide them. It will come for 3 nights, sniffing for food. We must hide them. I was stunned. What was this nonsense he was speaking? I went to the hospital. By now the sun had dropped over the horizon and the entire ward was both silent and dark. Stretching out before me, where only days earlier there had been very sick patients, there were 2 now only rows of entirely empty beds, or perhaps not only the beds, for at the far end of the ward, where the furthest bed met the double doors, there was something else, a shape, like a rounded hump as long if not longer than the bed itself sticking out above the edge of the bed. At first, I thought it was a pile of clothing or some equipment knocked over during the evacuation, but as I looked more closely I realized it was a back. The back of some immense animal or creature squatted down beside the bed and sniffing greedily at the air, trying to search out the smell of death or disease. As I waited with my eyes fixed on the end of the ward, I saw the shape shift. What I saw, I only glimpsed for a second before I ran. All I can say is that it looked like some kind of animal, a thing with straggly matted fur and long grasping teeth, but also that it moved or walked upright like a man. I pelted out if they're screaming, ran home and locked my door. When I returned to work 2 days later, I was nervous about entering the ward, but found when I walked in that it was exactly as it had been before. Full beds, patients in need, and no sign of any strange beast. I never mentioned what I had seen. Instead, I picked up my instruments, put on my mask, and got back to work. Later, my boss came to stand beside me. Smiling broadly, he told me that all of the evacuated patients had survived. Sometimes, he said with a grin, when evil comes knocking, it is best not to be home.